This is Voices of Customer Experience, a podcast where we bring you the very best thought leaders and practitioners of customer experience and its overlapping verticals, such as marketing, analytics, behavior economics, journey mapping, and design. Our goal is to help you be better at your job by listening to the experiences and leadership of others who, like you, have dedicated their careers to improving the dialogue between companies and customers. Voices of Customer Experience podcast is brought to you by Worthix, the first and only self-adaptive survey for measuring customer experience. Discover your worth at WorthXcom. Dave Fish is founder and CEO of CuriosityCX, an insights, creative, and customer experience agency. He has spent over 20 years understanding the gray areas of consumer behavior. Dave regularly writes and presents on CX topics. His work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Automotive News, CNN, USA Today, Reuters, and CRM Magazine. He's a regular contributor to the American Marketing Association and is a featured columnist on CustomerThink. He holds a Ph.D. in social psychology from Claremont Graduate University and as Adjunct Professor of Marketing at the Sam M. Walton School of Business at University of Arkansas. Welcome back to Season 3 of Voices of Customer Experience. I'm your host, Mary Drumond. Joining me today is James Conrad.
Hi, Mary. Great to be here.
And we have David Fish. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Mary. Hi, James.
Thanks so much for coming on today. We really appreciate it. For the benefit of our listeners and those who don't know your work, can you tell them a little bit about yourself, about your background, your education, what you do, and how you're trying to help CX with your work?
Sure. Yeah. So my story is a kind of a weird one. Like a lot of people in CX, there's no school of customer experience that one goes to. And so it's a meandering path that started in banking and made its way into automotive and actually launching products for a major manufacturer. Helped launch Tundra for Toyota.
Oh, nice.
And then, yeah. And so that was fun. And then kind of moved over into the world of customer experience. That was my first venture into that on the client side. It was a big sort of awakening because my background is traditionally in like market research and psychology and consumer behavior. And then I kind of jumped over into the world of customer experience. And at the time, it was more or less, and in some places still is, a compensation system where you go out and take measurements. And if you do really well, you get a trip to Tahiti. And if you don't do well, you might get your franchise pulled. So that was a big awakening for me. I spent a little time on the client side doing that, jumped over to J.D. Power and Associates, picked up my Ph.D. along the way in psychology, spent a good chunk of my career at MaritzResearch, now MaritzCX, running their different parts of the organization. I was in charge of our product development for them and ultimately was the CMO. Rolled out of there, got kind of tired of just doing the research bit of it, the sort of the measurement bit, and really started to develop a passion for influencing the customer experience. So not just measuring it and saying, hey, maybe you should think about doing this or that, but actually taking an active role with clients to actually affect the customer experience in store or online or wherever that happens. So with that in mind, I moved to another company. It's a shopper marketing agency here in beautiful Bentonville, Arkansas, where I live right now, called the Mars Agency. Led their customer experience practice there. They were very interested in helping a certain large organization here in Bentonville improve their in-store experience. Spent some time doing that. Ultimately, what I found, though, is that there's a lot of organizations that you can't escape who you are and where you come from. And I have the benefit of coming from the employee side, the research side, the marketing side, to some small extent the operations side, but your heritage really affects who you are when you grow up. And so what I found was if you're a marketing agency, you tend to think everything's about communication. If you're in human resources, you can affect everything with just getting the right people and training them well. And if you are in ops, it's all about efficiency and getting things there. If you're in the digital space, it's all about creating. And in reality, what I found was that it's really all these things. And no one was really good at doing all those things and bringing them all together. That's where I founded Curiosity. That's my practice. And it's a small boutique CX practice. I like to say we're a consulting firm that does a little research rather than the other way around. So we really focus in on helping clients understand the customer experience and then take that extra step to help them really affect it and change it and do some experiential design work. And we're not, necessarily experts in how you create a website or experts in supply chain, but we know experts who are. And so what we try to do is sort of bridge the gap between sort of the tactical doers in those big consulting companies that will give you advice, but maybe not give you the specifics on how exactly do we do that. And that's what curiosity is all about. And that's what I'm very passionate about.
Awesome. How much do you think your background in psychology contributes towards you having a better view of customer experience?
I think a lot because, ultimately we're all in the business of human behavior when it comes to customer experience. So understanding sort of the gray, I love the gray, like black and white is accounting and physics and engineering. A lot of those things are like you get an answer. But with human beings, it's, who knows why some people do what they do. And so it's always been really fascinating to me. And there's a lot of good theories and foundations in psychology that really gives you some insights and why people behave in, to quote a famous psychologist, in predictably irrational ways.
Love that book. Let me ask you something. Do you feel like that also reflects in your writing and in the articles you write? Because I see a lot of that behavioral science and the social psychology in your articles. I'm a big fan of your work and the stuff that you write. So I see that all the time. Do you try to get that across? Is that something that you try to share with the CX community of how others can also benefit from this knowledge?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's like, in academia, it's a bunch of theories, and theories are pointless unless there's some application to them. And so what I'm always trying to do is kind of fish, pardon the pun, fish in my background to pull out those relevant things that have applicability to the CX world. And there's a lot of them that you could pull into it. So it's been very helpful and a lot of fun. And it's what I've noticed. It's really sometimes the little things that are sitting right in front of you that can make huge differences. The way you say things and the way communications are just like the little things that people do or don't do that makes a huge impact to the customer experience.
Well, when I approached you about being on this podcast, you shared with me an article that you wrote about pizza in your hometown.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And I love that article. I shared it with James as well. But there was a line in there that really stuck with me, and it's consumers do not think in terms of partitioned off pieces of the experience, but of the experience as a whole. So that's you kind of addressing the individual silos that end up influencing the experience and how we need to approach it in a different way as a whole. But I mean, from a customer standpoint, that makes absolute sense. But from the company's standpoint, where we actually have to kind of fit all these pieces into the puzzle to make sure that the whole is great. What's some advice that you have for companies?
Yeah, it's sort of this experiential gestalt, right? So that people, when they walk into a store or a beauty salon or have a service, anything at all, they're not like thinking in terms of, I thought, the hair product they used was good, or, wow, these floors are clean. I mean, they're walking into it as one big whole and experience it as a whole. But a lot of times companies kind of get stuck in a lot of people talk about silos, right? And we got a lot of silos here in Bentonville, but
real ones.
Yeah, real ones. And it's true. We kind of get caught in our little world of, and I talk about frames quite a bit. It's like, so if you are in supply chain, like you could fix everything with supply chain, right? Like everything is a supply chain problem and everything's a supply chain solution. And that's sort of your worldview. And the same thing with marketing. And so to answer your question, small organizations have a real easy time. So in my writing, I talk about a lot of small, sometimes 1 or 2 person organizations, barber shops and coffee places and pizza parlors, and they're doing it and they don't even know it. Like they are so so enmeshed and kind of down into the weeds of how this all works that they don't even realize they're doing it. It's kind of like the idea of flow. Like when you're really good at what you're doing, you become elated and you don't even realize that you're doing it so well because you're so expert at it. Now, the reason these small organizations can do it well is because they're small. The barbershop does not have an operations. They don't have HR. They don't have finance. It's all 1 or 2 dudes or gals can do all this on their own. When we get to a larger scale, it gets a lot harder because there's so many people's hands getting involved. And so I think a couple of things, and advice to a large organization is you have to, first of all, it's the people. You have to have a passion. Everyone in the organization has to have that passion, from the founder and CEO all the way down to the front line. Great companies who are really good at CX, you could pull anyone at Disney aside and they're really into it. Like they believe in the brand. That's the easiest way of doing it. It's not easy, but that's the simple suggestion.
Simple, not easy, right?
Yeah, exactly. Other organizations approach it from a more of a standards approach. And that's it's a little harder, so like pick up the phone within 3 rings, or make sure you smile this wide and so on. Like, it's just fake. They're phoning it in. So standard programs don't tend to work as well as making sure you get the right people, making sure they believe in what your brand promise is, and then making sure having people be able to pull themselves out of their own operating theater to see how the rest of the organization works. And some organizations, I work for a lot of Japanese firms, and what they do is they rotate people around. When I was younger, I was like, that is stupid, man. You are rotating people around, and they just mastered their job barely, and you throw them over into logistics or something like that.
Right.
Well, there's a lot of wisdom in that, though, because as you move around the organization, you are able to see other parts of the organization, how they work, and gain some empathy, not only for customers, but also how those functions work. And on top of that, you're able to make social connections within the organization. We know that's how organizations really function, right? Is you call your pal over in distribution, you say, hey, what's really going on? And these interpersonal connections within the organization really help make them be quite effective. So that's sort of like my background in organizational development, connecting with consumer behavior. You can see how the two really interplay with one another, and how you can't really extract one from the other.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've had the same experience. Years ago, we worked with Toyota quite a bit, and exactly. And I remember one day we had our new research director, and he had come from accounting, and I'm like, oh, how's this going to work? But it was amazing though to see how they rotated through and how it built this sort of people that really understood the whole organization.
Yeah.
If you're tired of empty metrics and KPIs that have little or no correlation to your bottom line, your ROI, and your growth, it might be time to try something better. Worthix tells you why your customers are choosing to buy from you or not. So don't wait until your business becomes the next Toys R Us. Change at the speed of the new market by knowing if your brand is worth it. Learn more at WorthX.com.
Another thing you talked about in your article I thought was really interesting. I sort of pulled these lines. It was really well written. You say, thinking about what we just talked about and getting people on board and either having a standardized approach or driving this culture of passion, you say there's magic in being manically consistent. And we've talked a lot on the podcast about this, about, sort of delighting or having these moments of delight versus delivering consistency. What's your take on it? What did you mean when you said that? There's magic in being manically consistent, and what's your advice for companies today?
Well, people like consistency. The source of fear, like the definition of fear, is the fear of the unknown, right? Think about everything you're fearful about. You don't know what's going to happen. And so like eliminating that uncertainty is the core of the human condition, really, if you think about it. Everything in your life, you want to be certain about it. When you're certain, you're happy, you're satisfied. Now, there are cases where when there is uncertainty, it's not a bad thing, but it's on your terms. So the uncertainty of a surprise, it's a positive affect. It's an unexpected surprise. So you're not certain it's going to happen, but you're happy because it's a positive thing. The other side of that uncertainty is, like I said, fear. Like, oh my God, I don't know what's going to happen, but it's freaking me out, So as you travel, like imagine your day if everything was uncertain. If your car would start and if the traffic light, it'd be a miserable thing. So people look for that certainty in their life. In companies that deliver on that consistently, like in that pizza article, they've been making the same damn pizza for 100 years, and they're very successful at doing that. If you look back at some of the other brands that are outside of the world of Berwick, Pennsylvania, things like Twinkies and New Coke and sriracha sauce and other stuff that we tried to mess with, right? People freak out. They react to it. It's part of their social identity. It's part of who they are. It's part of being American in some cases, right? So don't you dare take my Twinkies away from me. I'll freak out.
Yeah, I don't want to buy them, but I want them to be on the shelf at the supermarket.
we have cosmic, certainty that those exist,
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot to be said with being persistently consistent in delivering the experience. Now, some people will say, that's cool, Dave, but that's a great way of becoming forgettable.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, when I use Amazon, for example, I'm not like, oh, I wish they'd be more difficult to work with because then I would use them more. Like, it doesn't hold any water for me. Making things more difficult makes for a more memorable experience. I think you want to remove those things that suck, right? And add those things that are great. Every business book that's out there for Blue Ocean Arm, that's what they talk about.
Right.
And if you look at all these examples out there of disruption, that's exactly what they're doing. They're removing the bad parts and they're doubling down on the good, and they're making it cheaper.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to bring up, Dave, because you want to stay traditional, you want to maintain a certain sense of identity, but at the same time, you do have to keep up with the speed of change, of innovation in the market. So there's kind of a balance there, because at times we want new stuff and sometimes we just want the familiar feeling of home, right?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think some companies kind of get confused, though, of where their place is on that. It's a hard thing to do. Like if you're Walmart or General Motors or Johnson & Johnson, you're huge corporations, been around for hundreds of years. People look to you and respect you and expect certain things from you. So it's going to be really hard to turn that ship quickly. I think what you see most often in terms of innovation and organizational change, and I've talked to a few people on this topic, is the best thing you could do is probably butt off and start a new organization that helps you be fresh and be not relevant, but be something new. Because it's really hard, again, back to my central premise, it's hard to escape who you are. And sometimes when you try to do that, it seems very inauthentic and fails miserably.
Yeah, we see this example a lot of companies that try and don't succeed in changing things up. And we also see the opposite of companies that don't try at all. And then they disappear from one day to the next, right?
Yeah, they double down and just say, if we just do more of the same, we'll be okay. It's worked for years, so let's just work harder at it,
Yeah, well, you have like that super famous example of, was it Xerox turning down Windows, right? Where they're like, we're not going to do this. And Kodak with the digital camera, they try to actually get rid of it and make it go away so that the market wouldn't evolve, right?
Yep. Yeah, and you're seeing it all over the place. You see it in hospitality and automotive, financial services, across the board. It's really kind of exciting times. And it's not without precedent, right? At the turn of the century, things were flipping around just like they are now. They just looked a little bit different. It's just be really exciting time to be a part of all this and involved and see it happening and hopefully be some kind of part of it and improving things for everyone as well.
The other thing you talked about in that article was about know thy customer. And I think you talked about, keeping things simple and it's a welcome idea in today's world where we feel like there's so much complexity. But I love when there's ideas that can sort of hone in on simplicity and don't overthink. But could you talk a little bit about what you were trying to get at with know thy customer?
I mean, I really got bought into this whole design thinking and customer empathy thing. I've been doing this for 20, 30, almost 30 years now. And, I've done a lot of quantitative research, and quantitative research is great. But there is nothing that substitutes going out and just talking to people and just getting to know them. And you just learn so much and you really do get that empathy. My whole thing is like, you could work in a big organization, but let's get out from our desks and let's go out and let's talk with people. The Pope, our current Pope, would sneak out at night and against the security forces' wishes and go out and talk with his flock, right? That's how you get to know things. That's how you really know what's going on. And again, it's not a new idea, but it's absolutely important to get out. And like if we can breaking down those walls between people designing products and services and getting them right in front of the customer and talking to them. I think in some cases, market research has done a disservice to the world and that it put a barrier between the customer and the person or people who are creating the product. I think market research's role or customer experience or whatever you want to call it, what we need to do is remove that barrier. We need to take down that one-way mirror and we need to get these people together. There's still a role for that. We're the facilitator. We're making sure this conversation is a productive one and there's a mutual respect there, that these customers are not subjects. they're human beings that have needs and wants and desires and kids and everything that's going on in the world. And so I think that's my other big passion is around that is getting people to talk with people and learning what they want and what they need and really getting that customer empathy.
Yeah, it's a great point, Dave. And you mentioned early in your introduction about your role now is more on the influencing customer experience side rather than the measurement. I wondered, with what you just talked about, where are you finding some of the best insights now that you're on the other side of the equation in helping companies take action?
What do you mean, like specifically?
Yeah,
where?
Like from where we were talking about getting out, talking to customers. You talked about quantitative data. As you think about where you source understanding and customer feedback, where are you finding your best insights as you're sort of influencing your customers and what they need to do? Where are you seeing that coming from now that you're sort of a user rather than a producer of data?
Yeah, I think it comes from all over. I tend to really, because if you talk to people, like I said, it's absolutely important, but you don't know if, Helen from Washington, D.C. is just a one-off or a representative of a lot of people. So you really have to balance. You do have to, there's still a place for quantitative research out there, as long as that quantitative research is good. And that could also be acquired through talking to people. We're on a project recently where we rode around on buses with people for 3 days, me and my team. And we just talked to people on buses. And it wasn't a structured format, but we were able to get quantitative information, but there was still that context. It wasn't, hey, hello, James, I'm calling on behalf of blah, blah, blah. It wasn't that kind of boring survey. So I think that's a good place. And we can't ignore the digital world, right? So there's just, I teach at University of Arkansas, and everyone says, oh, market research is going to die and blah, blah, blah. And, no one wants to take surveys anymore. And it's true, but the fundamentals are still there. People love talking about themselves. They do it on LinkedIn. They do it on Twitter. They do it on Facebook, and all that data is out there, and it's there for the grabbing. And on the other side, companies are still very thirsty to understand, more thirsty than ever to understand why customers are doing what they're doing. And so that whole digital world is absolutely critical.
Well, that's one thing that we find, we were talking about talking to people. And I can absolutely see that, when you're talking about a barbershop or when you're talking about a kind of mom and pop situation. But when you think of huge, massive enterprises or global companies and how difficult it is or how many degrees of separation there are between the CEO and a frontliner, who's the person that actually talks to the customer, so would you recommend in that case for the CEO to take some time? I know there are CEOs who do this and take a position in customer service or go to a store and talk to people, look at people and hear what they have to say. Do you think that's valid for big, huge enterprises as well?
Absolutely. I think that big company disease is when you do get separated from your customer and you get this sort of hubris and almost arrogance and condescension. It's like, oh, they're icky customers. They just buy our stuff. Really good companies do just that. Their CEO does go out and they talk with people and just, if you could just flatten those organizations out and decrease that. And it doesn't, like if you work in like accounts payable, it's like, what do I have to do with, customer experience? I don't have a role in that. Well, yeah, you do. I mean, anyone who's worked in any company knows that, accounts payable or receivable for that matter has a big role because they're collecting the money. And if you have a great experience with a company and the bill pay part of it sucks, that just ruins the whole thing. So I do one idea that, it's been around for a while and I often suggest it, and I haven't had any takers yet, is take a day and have everyone in that organization, that big global 50 organization, pick up the phone and call 5 customers and say, hey, just call on to see how things are going and to thank you for your business. Like, how powerful would that be if we just took a day to do something like that? It'd be huge,
Or maybe, as you're saying this, I'm thinking maybe we should all adapt the practices of these Japanese organizations and rotate our personnel all the time, because my gym does this. So at my gym, you'll have someone who works up on the, with the trainers, and then the next week is in the child center. And then after that, they're in the swim department. So there are organizations that do practice this. And I think that's amazing, because once you perceive the pains of each department, you have a much better knowledge or a much more solid base to understand what the customer needs.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
but once again, I don't know how possible this is in big, huge, massive organizations.
Well, it gets difficult too, because if you were trained in biochemistry, I'm probably too keen on like moving to the call center, right?
Right.
And that's cool. So there has to be some kind of balance in there for sure. But I think the other, James, you asked the other, like, what's a great source of information? Like in design thinking, they always talk about pretend you're a visitor from another country. And I think asking a lot of questions of people, and I embarrass my entire family because I ask tons of questions because I'm just curious about stuff. But the more questions you ask, the more you learn. And because people don't necessarily always volunteer things, until you start asking and probing and take an interest in what they're doing. And you learn a lot just by, walking into a hotel and say, hey, how does this work? And, why do you do that? And just ask those questions that others might not.
And if you ask at the right time, I think that in general, people are are happy to share what they do, talk about themselves, like you said, right? Or give you a little bit of insight into what they do.
Yeah, absolutely. People like talking about themselves, and people are interesting. I'm very lucky in what I do.
Well, I think that you named your company very appropriately as CuriosityCX in that. Well, David, thank you so much. We're kind of out of time, but for those who are listening and want to keep up with your work and follow your publications, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, sure. So I have a blog. It's CuriosityCX. You go out there and I publish on a regular basis. I'm also a columnist with CustomerThink. That's Bob Thompson's website. It's CustomerThink.com.
Mm-hmm.
And then, those are my two sources, and then I occasionally publish in AMA and elsewhere. But those are my two regular gigs that I publish in.
Thank you so much for being on here today, David. We really appreciate you coming on.
Hey, thanks. It's great talking with you guys. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you for joining us on one more episode of Voices of Customer Experience. This podcast is hosted and produced by Mary Drumond, edited and co-produced by Nick Gomez and Steve Barry. This podcast was brought to you by Worthix. Discover your worth at Worthix.com.